4. Imagine you are 20 years old. You are from Yorkshire, or from Kent, or from a mill town outside Manchester. You have been told by the officers who trained you that your tank cannot kill the enemy's tank from the front. Not at long range. 4. Not at medium range. Not at any range where you would want to be caught in the open. And this morning, in a French village called Villers-Bocage, you are about to find out exactly what that means. 4. The men brewing tea on that road in Normandy had 30 seconds left to live. They just didn't know it yet. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. The 13th of June, 1944. 4. A small French town buried in the green Norman countryside, 7 days after the largest amphibious landing in human history. The column of British armour stretched along Route Nationale 175, engines idling, hatches open. Cromwell tanks of the 4th County of London Yeomanry, half-tracks, Bren carriers, men brewing tea on the road because the morning had been quiet. 4. They belonged to the 22nd Armoured Brigade, the leading edge of the 7th Armoured Division, the famous desert rats who had beaten Rommel in Africa. Confidence hung over them like the summer haze. 4. They had driven 20 miles into German-held territory that morning. The road ahead was clear. The villages behind them had raised white flags. The war that morning felt as though it might be turning. They did not see the Tiger until it fired. 1 tank, 1 shot. The lead Cromwell of the reconnaissance troop erupted into a fireball on the road ahead. A second shot, a third. Steel that had crossed a continent now cooked, open in seconds, ammunition detonating inside sealed hulls, crews trapped or burning as they climbed clear. The men brewing tea dropped their tin cups and ran for cover that was not there. Road, straight and open, offered no refuge. A machine gun opened up from somewhere in the hedges. Men fell where they stood. Inside the Tiger, the routine was almost calm. Aim, fire, reload, advance. 4. The 88mm gun spoke in the flat, brutal syllable it had been designed for. The commander was 30 years old. 4. His name was Michael Wittmann, an SS Obersturmführer, France, a first lieutenant, France, of the 2nd Company, Brevi S Panzer Battalion 101. 4. Modern research places his Tiger at tactical number 205, though the historians have argued about that number for decades. What is not argued is what he did. In roughly 15 minutes, somewhere between 13 and 15 British armoured vehicles were destroyed on that road. Cromwells, Fireflies, half-tracks, scout cars, an entire brigade headquarters unravelling under the fire of a single tank commander and the small handful of Tigers that joined him. The brigade's commanding officer, Brigadier Robert Hind, would spend the rest of the day trying to reconstruct what had happened to a unit that had, an hour before breakfast, been the leading armoured formation in the 2nd Army. Cromwell crews were not cowards. They were not poorly trained. They fired back. Their 75mm shells struck the Tiger's frontal plate at close range and bounced away like pebbles thrown at a cathedral wall. Some of the men in those tanks had fought at El Alamein. They had crossed the Libyan desert. They had beaten Panzer IIIs and Panzer IVs in gun duels at ranges out to 1,000 yards. They knew how to shoot. Their guns simply could not do what the situation demanded. That was the war for the British tank soldier in the summer of 1944. That was the arithmetic, and every crew knew it. How does the country that invented the tank end up telling its bravest young men to reverse and hide when they meet the enemy? That is the story you are about to hear. The advice from brigade, from division, from corps, was the same wherever it came from. Reverse, create distance, get behind cover, call artillery, call the rocket-firing Typhoons. Do not, under any circumstances, engage a Tiger frontally at combat range. It was not doctrine written by cowards. It was doctrine written in blood by officers who had already counted the burning tanks of Tunisia, Sicily, Italy, and now Normandy. The math said no. and the math was right. For nearly 2 years, British tank regiments carried this instruction into every operation. To understand why, you have to understand the machine. The Panzerkampfwagen 6 Ausführung E the Tiger, 56.9 tons of welded steel, low and wide, its silhouette instantly recognizable from a kilometre away, first went into combat in late August 1942 near MGA on the Leningrad front and appeared in Tunisia by late November of the same year. Its baptism was not glorious. The first company sent to Russia bogged down in swampy ground and lost several vehicles to Soviet anti-tank fire before they had properly demonstrated the design. 4. In Tunisia, one of the first Tigers to see action was captured intact by the British in April 1943, or hauled back to England, France, and dissected at the Chertsey Research Establishment. British engineers walked around it slowly, France, measuring the plate, France, weighing the shells, 4, and going quiet, 4. Then came Kursk in July 1943, the largest tank battle in human history, 4. There, the Tiger established its reputation not through numbers but through kill ratios. A single well-positioned Tiger could destroy a dozen T-34s before it was overwhelmed. Stories filtered west through intelligence channels and reached the crews before the tanks did. Its frontal glacis armour, 100 mm of rolled homogeneous steel. Its turret face, 100 mm. For its side armour, 80 mm. And its main gun, the 8.8 cm WK-36L/56. At 500 meters, that gun could punch through approximately 120 millimeters of vertical armor, or at 1,000 meters it could still manage 100. There was no British tank in frontline service in 1943 that could survive a solid hit from that weapon at any range where it might realistically appear. 4. But here is the first thing they never told the tank crews. Here is the first strange truth about that gun. The weapon that made the Tiger the most feared machine on the battlefield had not been designed to kill tanks at all, or it had been designed to shoot down aeroplanes. The 88mm began its life in the 1930s as an anti-aircraft gun. The Flak 18, the Flak 36, 4 weapons of Hermann Göring's Luftwaffe, engineered to reach up into the sky and tear apart bombers with a projectile carrying enormous kinetic energy over long distances. Or, in the Spanish Civil War, German artillerymen serving with the Condor Legion discovered something unexpected. Or, when they leveled that anti-aircraft gun and pointed it forward, aimed at ground targets, the same ballistic properties that made it lethal against aircraft made it catastrophically effective against tanks. Or the desert campaigns of North Africa confirmed it. British armour rolling across the sand under a low sun would suddenly meet a flat trajectory for a hypersonic shell, for a hole punched clean through the front of a Matilda, Crusader, a Grant. For the aircraft hunters had become the tank killers. Rommel's Afrika Korps used the 88s at Halfaya Pass in 1941 to slaughter British armour that outnumbered his tanks by 3-1. British generals wrote report after report. London filed them away. The lesson took years to travel, the airman's gun, handed by accident to the tank arm, facing British crews for the next 3 years. But even that is only half the story, because the Tiger had a second secret. And the second secret was quieter and stranger, and it would have surprised any Cromwell driver crouched behind cover, praying not to see one. The Tiger was rare, not rare in reputation. In reputation, it was everywhere, in every after action report from Normandy, in every whispered conversation across a mess tin, in every radio call that came in with the words Tiger, France, 1 o'clock, 500 yards. But on paper, in cold factory numbers, the Tiger was almost a boutique weapon. The total production of Tiger tanks across the entire war was approximately 1,347 vehicles, not per year, total, from 1942 to the last chassis rolling out of Kassel in August 1944. Each one cost roughly 250,000 Reichsmarks to build. 4. A Panzer IV, Germany's workhorse medium tank, cost 117,000. For every Tiger, Germany could have fielded more than 2 of the tanks that actually did most of the fighting. 4. For every Tiger that reached the front, 6 T-34s came off the Soviet production lines, and the Tigers that were built broke. The Maybach transmission was chronically unreliable. 4. The final drives cracked under the strain of moving so much steel. The interleaved wheels froze solid in the mud of the Eastern Front. 4. The combat tracks were so wide that Tigers could not be transported by standard European railways without a crew climbing out to fit narrower transport tracks, then swapping them back before combat. 4. In Normandy, more Tigers were abandoned by their own crews for mechanical reasons than were destroyed by Allied fire. The Tiger's reputation had outrun the Tiger itself. Senior Allied officers, poring over the wreckage of Normandy, began to notice something that troubled them. Crews were reporting Tigers everywhere. Tigers in every hedgerow. Tigers at every crossroads. 4. And when the intelligence officers walked forward to inspect the burnt-out hulls, they kept finding Panzer IVs, Stuge assault guns, Panthers. Occasionally, yes, a real Tiger, but not the number the reports were claiming. The historians would later call it Tigerphobia, the tendency of Allied tank crews to see every German armoured vehicle as the vehicle they most feared. It was not stupidity, it was not exaggeration, it was survival instinct expressing itself as identification. 4. Because the difference between a Panzer IV and a Tiger, 4 at 400 yards, 4. When your gun could not penetrate one of them, 4. Was the difference between fighting and dying. 4. And in the tank arm of the British Army, that difference was becoming a crisis of command. To understand how they arrived at that crisis, you have to go back further, not to the war, but to before it. 4. To the drawing offices and staff colleges of the late 1930s, where a very British idea was taking shape. The British Army divided its tanks into 2 categories. Infantry tanks were heavy, slow, thickly armoured machines, built to accompany foot soldiers into the assault at walking pace. The Matilda, then the Valentine, then the Churchill. Each was their finest expression for its moment. Cruiser tanks were faster, lighter, thinner skinned vehicles intended to exploit breakthroughs and race through gaps in enemy lines. The Covenanter, the Crusader, the Cromwell, each category was optimized for its role. 4. Neither was optimized for what the war actually turned out to demand. Neither was designed to fight another tank on equal terms. The Covenanter, when it finally reached the troops in 1940, could not be sent overseas at all. Cooling system was so fundamentally flawed that the tank overheated on any warm day. Nearly 2,000 were built, and almost none saw combat. The Crusader that followed it broke down constantly in the North African heat. British desert crews joked bitterly that the fastest cruiser tank in the world spent most of its time being towed. The Cromwell, when it arrived in 1943, at last gave them a reliable cruiser. 4. But its gun was still at heart a compromise. France, that decision to keep the 2 categories separate were made by men in offices in London years before the first shot was fired. 4. Would cost lives in every campaign to come. 4. It was not stupidity. 4. It was a reading of the future that turned out to be wrong. Only when the testing began in the sands of Libya and the fields of Normandy did anyone realize how wrong. 4. By 1944, an entire generation of British tank soldiers was living with the consequences of that mistake. Among them, 1 division carried the story to come. The 11th Armoured Division, the Black Bull, formed in Yorkshire in March 1941 under a difficult, brilliant, sharp-tongued officer named Major General Percy Hobart. For Hobart was 55 years old, at the time of the division's formation an armour theorist who had spent much of the interwar period arguing with generals who did not want to be argued with. 4. He had been dismissed from the service before the war, thought unemployable, and was serving as a corporal in the Home Guard when Winston Churchill personally reached down and hauled him back into uniform. 4. He would eventually go on to command the 79th Armoured Division, the famous Hobart's Funnies, the specialized armor that opened the beaches on D-Day, but he shaped the 11th in its earliest years, trained its officers, 4. Instilled its ethos. In December 1943, command of the 11th passed to Major General George Philip Bradley Roberts. Everyone called him Pip. He was 37 years old. 4. He was, by some margin, the youngest divisional commander in the British Army. He had come up through the Royal Tank Corps, fought in the Western Desert with the 7th Armoured Division, and understood tanks the way a violinist understands strings. 4. He had commanded a brigade at Alam el Halfa in 1942, held the line against Rommel's last real offensive in Africa, and been recommended for the higher command by every senior officer who had watched him work. He knew what his machines could do. He knew precisely what they could not. 4. And he knew that when his crews rolled into Normandy the following summer, they would be climbing into vehicles whose main guns could not defeat the Tiger's frontal armor at any realistic range. Roberts would take his division into some of the hardest fighting of the campaign. He would lose men and tanks in numbers that a peacetime army cannot imagine. He would watch his soldiers do what soldiers do. France, with the equipment they had been given, not the equipment they wished for. 4. But somewhere, on drawing boards in Lancashire, or in the design offices of a company called Leyland Motors, 4. A different tank was being born. 4. A machine designed to change the arithmetic that had been drilled into every British tank crew since the beginning of the war. The question was how long it would take, and how many crews would climb into how many burning Cromwells before it arrived. Britain had built the first tank in human history. In 1916, on the Somme, British engineers had rolled out lumbering iron beasts that terrified the German infantry and changed warfare forever. 4. The word tank itself was a British invention, a code name used to disguise the project as water storage containers being shipped to the front. That legacy hung over every discussion in London. 4. And yet, 3 decades later, the country that had invented the tank was fielding cruiser vehicles whose guns bounced off the frontal armor of the enemy's heaviest machine. How does that happen? The answer is not simple. 4. It is not a single villain, not a single mistake, not a single wrong decision. 4. It is a slow accumulation of assumptions, budgets, France and the doctrines, and industrial priorities that added up, France over 15 years, through men climbing into machines whose guns could not save them. 4. The answer is also not without hope. 4. Because in a factory in Leyland, Lancashire, a group of engineers were about to solve the problem. They would call the result the A-34, the Comet. 4. And when it arrived at last, a cold field in Belgium, in the last days of 1944, 4. It would carry a gun that changed the conversation forever. 4. But the crews who received it had first to survive the winter. 4. They had first to endure one final catastrophe, and in a moment none of them could have foreseen. On the 16th of December 1944, everything was about to go wrong. The 18th of July 1944, a wheat field east of Caen, Normandy. The sun rose over ground that would, before the day was done, be scorched black by the largest concentration of armour Britain had ever committed to a single battle. They called it Operation Goodwood. 3 armoured divisions, more than 1,000 tanks, preceded by the heaviest tactical air bombardment in the history of warfare up to that point. 4 wave after wave of Lancasters and Halifaxes of RAF Bomber Command and American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators from the 8th Air Force, emptying their bomb bays over German positions until the earth itself seemed to buckle. 7,000 tons of high explosive fell in less than 3 hours. Villages disappeared. For German infantry, buried in slit trenches 5 feet deep, 4 were killed by concussion alone. France, their bodies unmarked. 4. From the observation posts along the ridges, British officers watched the sky darken with aircraft and told each other, quietly, surely nothing could survive underneath that. Something did survive underneath it. 4. Somewhere in the wheat dug into hedgerows and sunken roads, Tiger tanks of Heavy Panzer Battalion 503 were waiting. Panthers of the SS Panzer formations holding the sector, including elements of Kampfgruppe Wünsche from the 12th SS Panzer Division. 4 88mm anti-tank guns lined up along the Borgebus Ridge, calm, patient and still functional after all that had fallen from the sky. 4. When the British armour rolled forward across that open ground, the killing began at almost 800 yards. 4. The lead squadrons of the 11th Armoured emerged from the smoke of the bombardment and drove straight into a kilometre-deep killing zone. 4. The village of Cagny, which the bombers were supposed to have flattened, still held a battery of 88s under an experienced Luftwaffe major named Hans von Luck. Those guns alone destroyed dozens of British tanks in the first hour. Or Pip Roberts, 38 years old now, watched his own 11th Armoured Division advance into the fire. He had already argued about this operation. Or he had gone to his corps commander, France, for Lieutenant General Sir Richard O'Connor, for a man Roberts respected profoundly, France, and he had said what a divisional commander should never have to say to his corps commander, is not right. Or the infantry are not close enough, the flanks are not secured. My tanks will go forward without proper support and they will burn. O'Connor had listened. 4. And O'Connor had passed the plan up unchanged. 4. Because the orders came from higher still, from Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery himself. 4. And there was a political dimension to this battle that had nothing to do with tank crews. France, Roberts obeyed. What else could he do? In 3 days, 8th Corps lost approximately 314 tanks. Cromwells, Sherman's Fireflies. Some crews got out, many did not. British tank soldiers, some of them boys of 19 and 20 from Yorkshire and Lancashire and the home counties, died in metal boxes on a wheat field because their guns could not answer. The guns pointed at them. Or the recovery teams that went in after the battle would find Cromwells with clean holes, punched through them from front to back, entrance and exit both through the frontal glasses. Or the 88 had gone through both plates as though the steel were paper. Or if you have ever wondered why a man like Pip Roberts, decorated, France, respected, France, still in his 30s, or would carry a weight in his eyes for the rest of his life that he could not name in polite conversation. But the answer is in that wheat field. Or, and 100 fields like it. The technology had failed the men, not the men. Or, and in London. For the men who made the decisions about technology had, at last, France, and for run out of time. For the immediate answer had already been improvised. For its name was the Sherman Firefly. The idea came from an unlikely place. 2 officers of the Royal Armoured Corps, Major George Brighty and Lieutenant Colonel George Witheridge, had been arguing since 1943 that the 17-pounder anti-tank gun could be fitted into a tank turret if the engineers stopped saying no and started trying. Brighty in particular pushed hard against a Ministry of Supply that had ruled the marriage impossible. Witheridge, who had lost his own tank to a German gun in the desert and knew exactly what he was arguing for, added the political weight. 4. Somewhere in the workshops of the Royal Ordnance Factory, an engineer named W.G.K. Kilbourne did what engineers do when they are given an impossible problem. 4. They looked at the 17-pounder anti-tank gun, a magnificent British weapon capable of penetrating 130mm of vertical armour at 500 yards, and they asked whether it could be crammed into a tank turret. The answer from every existing British tank was no. The Cromwell turret would not take it, the Churchill turret would not take it, but the American Sherman turret, with modifications, would. So they modified it. They rebuilt the gun mounting. 4. They moved the radio out of the turret and down into a box welded to the back, They removed the loader's hatch to make space for the 17-pounder's enormous ammunition. 4. And they mounted the gun tilted on its side, so the breech would clear the turret walls when it recoiled. The result was ungainly. The result was uncomfortable. The result was a Sherman with a barrel so long it looked wrong from every angle. 4. But the result could kill a tiger. The Firefly entered service in early 1944 in time for the Normandy landings. British and Canadian armoured units fielded them in a very specific ratio. 4. At the time of the landings, 1 Firefly for every 3 standard Shermans. In a troop of 4 tanks, 3 guns that could not penetrate a tiger from the front, 1 that could. 4. That ratio, all by itself, was a confession written in tactical formation. This is what we could manage. This is what the war has done to our tank design. The Germans noticed immediately. 4. Within weeks of Firefly appearing in Normandy, orders went out to every German tank commander and every anti-tank gunner. Kill the long-barreled Sherman first. Kill the gun that can hurt us before you deal with the others. 4. You could identify a Firefly from a kilometre away by the length of its barrel. British crews began painting the muzzle in mottled camouflage to break up the silhouette. Some crews sawed off the counterweight at the muzzle to shorten the appearance. 4. Some painted a false, shorter barrel onto the length of the real one, so that from a distance the Firefly might be mistaken for an ordinary Sherman. Anything to buy an extra second, anything to disguise the vehicle that carried the sting. 4. The Firefly saved lives. It also, by its very existence, admitted the failure of everything that had come before it. 4. Which is why, quiet France, in Lancashire, France, in the town of Leyland, 4 engineers at Leyland Motors had been working on something more. 4. The company had already built Cromwells. They knew the chassis, knew the running gear, knew the strengths and the flaws. The chief designer, Claude Gibb, and his team had spent months looking at what a proper next-generation cruiser tank would need. 4. The requirement from the Ministry of Supply was, on paper, straightforward. Design a new tank, keep the mobility of the Cromwell, add better armour, fit a gun that can defeat German heavy armour at combat range, do it fast. 4. Every one of those requirements pulled against the others. A bigger gun needed a bigger turret. A bigger turret needed a bigger turret ring. A bigger turret ring changed the geometry of the hull. More armour meant more weight. More weight meant the engine had to work harder. The suspension had to be re-engineered. Every element touched every other element. Now here is something the popular histories rarely tell you. 4. The gun that everyone remembers as the Comet's weapon, the 77mm high velocity, was not what the designers wanted. It was what they got when their first choice failed. The original plan called for a brand new gun from Vickers. 4. A high velocity 75mm, elegantly designed, using the same ammunition family as the American guns already flooding into British service. Standardization, simplicity, common supply chains. On paper, it was perfect. 4. When the engineers reached the stage of actually fitting the Vickers gun into the Comet's turret, the geometry did not work. The gun was too long. The recoil path fouled the turret walls. 4. Weeks of work, thousands of pounds of investment, dozens of engineering drawings. All of it discarded. The project nearly died. Instead, they went to the 17-pounder family. And here is the second thing the popular histories usually get wrong. 4. The 77mm high velocity is not, as you will read in 100 books, a shortened version of the 17-pounder. It is something more interesting than that. It fires a projectile closely related to the 17-pounder's shell. 4. But the propellant charge, or the brass case that contains the powder, 4, is shorter and wider. 4, redesigned specifically to fit the loading geometry of the Comet's turret. The rate of fire is faster. The ammunition stows more compactly. Crew can operate the gun without contortion. It is a purpose-built weapon, dressed in a related projectile's clothing. Muzzle velocity roughly 790 meters per second with standard armor-piercing ammunition. Enough to change the arithmetic that had killed so many crews on so many fields. Around that gun, the engineers built a tank. The engine came from Rolls-Royce. It was called the Meteor, and its ancestry ran back to the Merlin, the same power plant that had carried Spitfires and Hurricanes into the sky during the Battle of Britain. When production capacity ran short, Rover and Morris were brought in as licensed builders. 600 horsepower, 12 cylinders. Robust in a way the earlier British tank engines had not been, it had proved itself in the Cromwell, or it would prove itself again in the Comet. The armour, 101 millimeters on the front plate, roughly comparable to what the Tiger itself carried on its own frontal surfaces. The top speed on good roads, approximately 51 kilometers per hour. Faster than a Tiger, faster than a Panther, fast enough to outrun what it could not outshoot if it came to that. The mild steel prototype was completed in February 1944. Testing followed through the spring at the fighting vehicles. Proving establishment at Chertsey, small changes were made. The transmission was modified. The roof was reshaped. The commander's cupola was redesigned 3 times. Production models began to leave the Leyland factory floor in September 1944. By December 31, Comets had crossed the Channel to France. They were sent to the 29th Armoured Brigade, part of Pip Roberts' 11th Armoured Division. The brigade commander was Brigadier Roscoe Harvey, a Normandy veteran in his mid-40s, a man who had watched too many Cromwell crews die in that wheat field. Under Harvey were 3 regiments: the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, 23rd Hussars, the 2nd Fife, and Forfar Yeomanry. These men had crossed the Channel in Shermans. They had fought all summer in Shermans. They had lost friends in Shermans. Now in a cold field in Belgium near the town of Ypres, they turned in every one of those American tanks to the replacement depot and stood by France, waiting for the new British machines that would carry them into Germany. The date was the 15th of December, 1944. The next morning, everything went to hell. At dawn on the 16th of December 1944, in a snow-dusted forest called the Ardennes, 24 German divisions came out of the tree line, 200,000 men, nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns. The last great offensive of the German army in the West. Its code name was Wacht am Rhein. The world would come to know it as the Battle of the Bulge, Sherman-less, Comet-less, in between. The 29th Armoured Brigade had turned in its tanks the day before. Its crews had trained on Comets for perhaps a week. There were not enough Comets yet to equip them. There were no Shermans because they had all just been driven to the depot. They were at that moment an armoured brigade with almost no armour. The order that came down from Field Marshal Montgomery was as simple as it was brutal. Go and get your Shermans back now, any Sherman. Any condition, make them work. Take them south. Hold the Meuse. Men who had been counting the days to Comet delivery ran back to the depot. France climbed into the very tanks they had signed off the day before, or coaxed cold engines into life, and drove south into a blizzard toward the river Meuse. The 23rd Hussars and the 2nd Dife and Forfar Yeomanry took up positions guarding the crossings at Givet and Namur. The 3rd Royal Tank Regiment pushed further, south to Dinant, where the leading edge of the German offensive was clawing its way toward the river. On Christmas Day, 1944, the 3rd RTR made contact with the 82nd Reconnaissance Battalion of the American 2nd Armoured Division northwest of a Belgian village called Celles. There, in one of the coldest days of a bitter winter, the leading Panthers of the 2nd Panzer Division emerged from a wood line and were destroyed at close range by combined British and American fire. Between them, British Shermans and American Shermans, they stopped the last German push short of the Meuse. tanks against tanks in the snow, with tea getting cold in mess tins on hulls, and men who had expected to spend the winter learning a new machine, spending it instead fighting for their lives in the old one. 4. That night, some of the British crews shared their Christmas rations with the Americans they had linked up with. Corned beef and hard biscuit under a starlit sky in a country neither army had wanted to be in. Comet program was postponed by more than a month, or only in January 1945, after the Ardennes offensive had spent itself against American and British resistance, did the crews finally return to Belgium and, at the town of Gravelines, receive their new tanks in earnest. Time. The training completed, ergonomics learned, ammunition drills memorized, radio procedures adjusted, or every man in every crew putting his hands on the new controls, and, for the first time in the war, sitting in a British machine whose gun could speak to a Tiger on equal terms. By February, they were ready, or as ready as men can ever be. They were sent to the Rhineland, Operation Veritable, the last great push to close the west bank of the Rhine before the Allied armies crossed into Germany itself. The 11th Armoured Division fought there in conditions that would produce, according to official Commonwealth records, the highest rate of combat exhaustion of any formation in the campaign. Mud, rain, sleet, or weeks of grinding attritional combat through the flooded plains and dense forest of the Reichswald, ground so wet that tanks sank to their hulls, so wooded that infantry had to hack paths for the armour with axes. On the 26th of February 1945, they attacked a wooded ridge called the Gockfersberg. 2 days later, they took it. In the days that followed, the division supported the capture of Sulzbach by Canadian units, helping to break a section of the German Schlieffen defensive line. The Comet was proving itself in the mud, reliable, fast when the ground allowed. The Meteor engine humming steadily, where earlier British engines would have coughed and died. But there is one more truth about the Comet that the popular histories tend to smooth over. And you deserve to hear it plainly, because the story only means something if it is told honestly. The Comet did not make the crews invincible. The Tiger's frontal armour, 100mm of vertical plate, was inside the 77mm penetration envelope at combat ranges. At 500 yards, with armour-piercing ammunition, a Comet could reach through that plate. That was the change everyone had been waiting for. But the Panther, the German medium tank that was actually more common than the Tiger in the West by 1945, was a different problem. Frontal glacis was 80mm thick, but it was sloped at 55 degrees. That slope, geometrically, made the plate behave like something closer to 140mm of effective armour when a shell struck it. At long range, a Comet firing standard armour-piercing ammunition could not reliably defeat a Panther's front. There was an answer. Its name was APDS, Armour-Piercing Discarding Sabot, or a newer generation of ammunition in which a small or dense tungsten core rides inside a lightweight carrier that falls away after leaving the muzzle, allowing the core to travel at extraordinary velocities, roughly 1100 meters per second. With APDS, the Comet's 77mm could reach through the Panther's slope at ranges that would have been impossible with standard ammunition, but APDS was in for short supply. Not every Comet carried it. Not every engagement began at ranges where it mattered most, and in the wrong tactical situation, a Comet could still burn. The Tiger was no longer untouchable, that was true. But no tank was ever truly untouchable, and the men who climbed into their Comets in the spring of 1945 did not think of themselves as riding invincible chariots. They thought of themselves as men who had at last been given a fair chance, not a guarantee, a chance. For soldiers, that is more than most wars ever give. The winter passed. The rain stopped. The mud began to dry. And on the far bank of a wide grey river, called the Rhine, Germany itself waited. On the night of the 23rd of March, 1945, 3,500 artillery pieces opened fire along the western bank of the Rhine. 4. The largest artillery barrage in the Western Theatre since El Alamein. Assault boats crossed under a moon obscured by smoke. 4 airborne divisions dropped east of the river. The following morning, the largest single-day airborne operation of the war, 5,000 aircraft blackening the sky. Bridges were laid. Bridgeheads were held. France, 5 days later. 4. On the 28th of March, France, at the town of Wesel. 4. The 11th Armoured Division rolled across the Rhine in Comet tanks. The first fully equipped Comet division in history, crossing into Germany. The Meteor engines running clean. 4. The 77mm barrels tracking the horizon. Pip Roberts in a command tank at the head of his division. 38 years old, watching the country he had been trying to reach for 2 years finally open up in front of him. 4. Somewhere ahead of them, in a wood near a small river called the Aller, 6 Tiger tanks and their crews were waiting. The engineering was done. The men were trained. Now it was time to find out what all of it was worth. 4. The road east of the Rhine ran through country the crews of the 11th Armoured Division had never seen. Small towns with red-tiled roofs, farm carts pushed by old men and women, white sheets hung from upstairs windows. 4 old women, standing at their gates, staring at British tanks that a month before had been impossible to imagine on a German road. France, and in the ditches. 4. The occasional Wehrmacht helmet, discarded by a soldier who had decided that the war for him, 4, was finally over. The Comets moved fast, faster than any British armour had ever moved in an offensive. 50 kilometres a day on good roads. Sometimes more. Pip Roberts pushed his division hard because he understood something that the men in the tanks could feel in their bones but had no words for. The war was ending. 4. Every day of delay was a day when men who had survived Normandy, Arnhem and the Ardennes might still die, and in the east another army was coming. On the 30th of March, the leading elements reached the town of Gescher. 4. On the 1st of April, they crossed the Dortmund-Ems Canal, then climbed into the wooded heights of the Teutoburg forest. The fighting there was harder than the crews had expected. Small groups of German infantry, some of them boys of 15 and 16, some of them old men from the Volkssturm Home Guard, fought with a fury that made no strategic sense. For they knew they had lost. They fought anyway. The Comets took losses at Brochtebeck, more at Tecklenburg. 4. Men who had survived every previous phase of the war now died in the last month of it, in a forest that meant nothing to anyone outside Germany, killed by teenagers with anti-tank rockets called Panzerfaust. 4. On the 7th of April 1945, the 2nd Dive and Vorfahr Yeomanry drove their Comets across the River Weser at a town called Peterschegen. An army photographer named Sergeant Anlaing was there. 4. He took a photograph, catalogued in the Imperial War Museum archives as BU 3200, of Comet tanks fording the bridge as spring sunlight caught the barrels. 4. If you have ever seen that photograph, and men of a certain age often have, you know the look of it. Steel and water and pale European light, and inside each of those tanks, 4 or 5 men whose names most of us will never know. 4. They were driving toward the Baltic. They did not know it yet. They also did not know that somewhere ahead of them a small and desperate group of Tigers was moving south to meet them. The German unit was called Kampfgruppe Fährmann. 4. It had been assembled in the first days of April at the Panzertruppenschule Bergen, the Panzer training school north of the Aller River. Every gun crew and mechanic who could still function was pulled together. Instructors who had spent the last 2 years teaching classroom tactics were told to climb back into tanks and drive. 5 Panthers, 6 Tiger tanks, all of them Tiger 1s, first-generation machines. Some of them tired, some of them worn out from years of use, all of them still lethal. The overall commander was Major Schulze. The Tigers were led by Oberleutnant Fährmann, first lieutenant, whose age is not recorded in the surviving files, but who was almost certainly, for like most junior officers in the Panzer Arm by April 1945, for a young man in his 20s, promoted early because everyone senior to him was dead. He painted a large letter F on the turret of each of his tanks, along with numbers from 01 to 05 and 13. 4. His orders were to break through the Allied lines and reach the Panzerlehr Division, which was trapped in the Ruhr pocket further to the south. It was, and everyone involved knew it was, a suicide mission. The pocket was already sealed. 4. There was nothing to reach. But orders were orders in the last month of the Third Reich, and Fairman's Tigers moved forward because there was no one to countermand them. 4. On the 9th of April, France for one of the Tigers, 4 F-02, Krug, a Panzerfaust, hit at the western edge of a village called Frill that jammed its main gun. Crew withdrew under fire. 4. They repaired the tank overnight in a workshop, cannibalized from whatever they could scrounge. On the 10th of April, F-02 reported to Kampfgruppe Grossan, headquartered at a village called Ostenholz. 4. On the 11th of April, at a town called Bad Eilsen, the American 5th Armored Division ambushed the leading elements of the Kampfgruppe. 2 Tigers destroyed, Major Schulze's own Panther knocked out, 2 half-tracks burned. 4. The Kampfgruppe was already gutted before it had really begun. Schulze himself survived and continued to command what was left, but the Panthers were finished. Only the Tigers remained combat effective, and only a few of them. 4. On the 12th of April, F-02 was sent forward again. This time toward a bridgehead the British had just seized across the river Aller near a village called Essel. That bridgehead was held by the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, Comets. 4. What happened over the next 24 hours is documented in the war diaries of the 3rd RTR, held today at the National Archives at Kew. 4. It is also documented in a book by the German historian Wolfgang Schneider called Tigers in Combat, Volume 2, drawn from surviving German records. The 2 accounts, British and German, agree on the essential facts. 4. On the 12th of April, Tiger F-02, commanded by Oberleutnant Fairman, emerged from the tree line on the north side of the Aller. 4. In front of him were British Comet tanks defending the bridgehead. He fired. He knocked out 2 Comets. For a half-track, a scout car. 2 Comet crews died that day, or the survivors climbed out with burns that would follow them home. British men in their late teens and 20s, at the end of a war that was days away from being won, killed by a Tiger commanded by a young German officer in the last unhappy weeks of the Third Reich. The tank whose reputation was supposed to be broken by the Comet had France, in that particular hour, France, on that particular field, or killed Comets instead. France. This is the part of the story the popular histories usually leave out. 4. Because it complicates the arithmetic. Because it reminds us that no machine ever protects a man completely, and no engineering advance ever ends the danger entirely. The Tiger was not untouchable anymore, but it was still lethal, for Oberleutnant Fairman withdrew F-02 into the forest that evening. What he thought that night in the last few hours of his war, we will never know. Whether he considered surrender, or whether he understood that the men waiting for him in the morning were the same regiment whose comrades he had just killed, whether he thought about his family, whether he slept, or on the morning of the 13th of April 1945 he moved forward again, this time south from Ostenholz. No infantry escort because the Kampfgruppe had no infantry left, or a single Tiger alone in wooded country, or hunting for a British column and France, without knowing it, or being hunted in return. France, somewhere near a stream called the Drebber, for a Comet tank of a squadron, 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, or was watching the tree line. 4. The tank commander was Sergeant Harding, first name lost to the records, or at least not recorded in the sources that have survived. 4. A British non-commissioned officer, almost certainly in his 20s, who had probably fought all the way from Normandy in a Sherman before receiving his Comet in January. He saw the Tiger first. 4. He held his fire until the German tank had committed to its move. He waited until the flank came into view. According to Schneider's German sources, the range was approximately 60 meters. According to some British sources, closer to 100. Or either way, it was point blank in tank warfare terms. He fired. The 77mm punched through the Tiger's side armor. France, the tank that had, 24 hours earlier, or killed 2 Comets of that same regiment, ignited. Or F-02 was destroyed. The fate of Oberleutnant Fairman himself is not clearly established in the surviving records. His name disappears from the German casualty lists of that week, but so did many names in the final chaos of the Reich. 4. The Comet had done what the Comet had been built to do, and the man who did it, Sergeant Harding, did not celebrate. There is no diary entry from him that has survived to describe the moment. 4. He was a British tank sergeant at the end of a war, doing his job in a wood in northern Germany, and by the time the sun set that evening, his crew were already moving on. 4. Because there was more country still to cross, and more Germans still fighting, and the war was not yet done. 4. That single engagement on the Drebber stream on the 13th of April, 1945, is the clearest documented case in the entire war of a British Comet destroying a German Tiger I in tank versus tank combat. 4. It is the story the entire video has been building toward. It is also, and this is important, an isolated incident. France. The 11th Armoured Division lost 26 Comets over the course of the campaign, bridge to anti-tank guns, mines, France, and Panzerfausts. 4. The Comet did not spend its war dueling Tigers because there were almost no Tigers left to duel. Sergeant Harding's shot was the exception, not the pattern. But it was enough. 4. Because in the moment when it happened, on that specific stretch of wooded German ground, the arithmetic that had ruled the British tank arm for 3 long years had finally reversed. 4. A British sergeant in a British tank had at last been given a weapon that could do what the doctrine had always denied him. 2 days later, the same division would meet something that no engineering advance could have prepared them for. 4. On the 15th of April 1945, following a local ceasefire arranged with a retreating German officer, 3 days earlier, the 11th Armoured Division occupied a concentration camp near the village of Bergen-Belsen. 4. What they found there is beyond the scope of a tank video, and it should be, but it belongs in this story because of what it did to the men who found it. 4. The Comet crews of the 11th had spent nearly 3 weeks pushing hard across Germany, engaging every kind of resistance from Panzerfaust ambushes to Tiger tanks. 4. They were hardened men in the specific and terrible way that combat hardens young men. Bergen-Belsen unmade them. Pip Roberts wrote about it in his memoirs decades later. Force. He called it, in the understated language of his generation, an experience that changed the men who saw it. He did not need to say more than that. 4. The photographs and the film footage of that camp, taken by British Army cameramen in the days after liberation, have carried the rest of the story on their own for 80 years, the tanks. The tanks moved on. They had 4. By the 18th of April, the leading Comets of the 11th reached the Elbe River near Lüneburg. On the 30th of April, they crossed the Elbe at a place called Artlenburg. 4. From there north toward the Baltic Sea, in a final race that was no longer against the Wehrmacht, but against a different army entirely. The Red Army was pushing west. The British and Americans were pushing east. 4. Whoever reached the Baltic coast first would decide the post-war map of Northern Europe, whether Denmark would sit inside the Western Zone or the Eastern one, whether Schleswig-Holstein would answer to London or to Moscow, or whether the Soviets would gain a foothold on the North Sea. Winston Churchill, back in London, understood this with absolute clarity, for he had already begun to speak, in private, of what he would soon call an Iron Curtain descending across the continent. The war against Germany was ending. The war of ideology and empire that would replace it had already begun. 4. And the orders that came down to Pip Roberts' division were straightforward. Go north. Go fast. Reach Lübeck before the Soviets do. The Comets ran. 4. They ran on the German autobahns at 40 kilometers an hour. France, hour after hour. The Meteor engines humming steady. Crews taking turns to sleep across the ammunition boxes and against the turret rings. 4. 18 years old and 38 years old side by side. France for unshaven. France, exhausted, propelled by the strange final urgency of a war that everyone knew was ending, but that nobody could yet stop pushing. 4. They passed streams of refugees moving in the opposite direction. German civilians fleeing west from the Red Army, dragging their belongings behind them. 4. They passed released prisoners of war, hollow-cheeked British and French and Polish men, who wept when they recognized the shape of an Allied tank. 4. On the 2nd of May 1945, the leading Comets of the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment entered Lübeck. The Baltic Sea was in front of them. The Red Army was still 40 kilometers east. 4. Denmark and the future shape of Europe had been saved by the speed of British tanks. On the 3rd of May they took Neustadt. On the 8th of May, Germany surrendered. 4. On the 23rd of May, elements of the 11th captured the last officials of the government of Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the man who had briefly succeeded Adolf Hitler as head of state. 4. In the town of Flensburg. 4. In total, the division had taken the surrender of approximately 80,000 German troops and 27 generals. Then the shooting stopped. Now, here is the honest reckoning. The Comet did not win the war. It did not shorten it. It arrived at the very end. It fought for perhaps 6 weeks. It killed, in confirmed engagements, exactly 1 tiger. If you measure a weapon system by its impact on the war it was built for, the Comet was too late. 4. But the men who built it, France, and the men who fought it, understood something we should not lose sight of. For all these years later, but the Comet was not just the tank of 1945. 4. It was the tank that made every British armoured vehicle after it possible. Because from the Comet came the Centurion, and the Centurion changed everything. The Centurion entered service in 1949-4, 4 years after the war ended, fought in Korea, where British Centurions of the 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars held off Chinese assaults at ranges that would have been suicidal in Cromwells. It fought at Suez in 1956. It fought in the Indo-Pakistani Wars. 4. Israeli Centurions destroyed Syrian armour on the Golan Heights in 1973, holding the line in one of the most desperate tank battles of the 20th century. Persians served in the armies of more than a dozen nations across 4 decades, and every improvement, every design choice, every solved problem in the Centurion had first been solved in the Comet. The turret geometry, the engine placement, suspension, the gun mounting philosophy. Centurion was the Comet grown up, France, and it was, by common consent, one of the finest tanks of the 20th century. Britain had at last learned to build tanks properly. The lesson took too long. 4. The lesson cost too much. But the lesson had been learned. There is one final image, and I want to leave you with it. The 21st of July 1945. Berlin. The city was in ruins. 60% of its housing destroyed. 4. Its people scavenging in the rubble for food. The war had been over for 6 weeks. On a broad avenue called the Charlottenburger Chaussee, running through the ruined heart of the former German capital, the British Army held a victory parade. Winston Churchill was there, watching from a reviewing stand, cigar in hand. So were General Bernard Montgomery and men from a dozen other Allied armies. The Comets of the 11th Armoured Division rolled past. 4. They were not the tanks that had won the war. They had arrived too late for that. They were the tanks that had finally been worth waiting for. Every one of them a promise kept, even if the promises had been kept later than it should have been. 4. Every one of them a machine. that meant, in the specific and unforgiving language of tank engineering, that the men inside hand had been given the same chance in a fight that the enemy had. For Pip Roberts was there, in a command tank near the head of his division. 38 years old, nearly 2 years of war behind him as a divisional commander, youngest of his rank in the British Army. In front of him, the leaders of the free world, or behind him, 26 Comet crews who would never come home. He did not need to say anything. He did not need to explain what he felt. The tanks passed. Churchill saluted them. The war was over. And somewhere in the ranks of that column, in one of those hulls, men who had 3 months earlier, watched a tiger burn on the banks of the river Drebber, they knew what they had done. We should know it too. Because the story of the Comet is not really the story of a tank. It is the story of a country that got it wrong for a long time. France, at terrible cost, France, and then, at the last possible moment, France, and forgot it right. It is the story of engineers in a Lancashire factory who solved the problem too late but solved it correctly. It is the story of a division commander who lost too many men in machines that were not good enough. And then led the survivors. In machines that finally were. France, across the Rhine, France, across the Elbe, and to the Baltic Sea. It is the story of every mistake that a democracy makes when it prepares for the wrong war, and every act of engineering and courage that eventually corrects it. Pip Roberts himself lived until 1997, 91 years old when he died. He wrote his memoirs late in life and titled them, From the Desert to the Baltic. Every man who served under him remembered him as fair, exacting, and unwilling to spend lives cheaply, he never quite got over Goodwood. Few divisional commanders who lived through it did. Sergeant Harding disappears from the historical record after that day on the Drebber. He may have gone home to a mill town, or a farm, or a factory. He may have married and raised children who never quite understood why their father would not talk about the war. He may still be remembered by grandchildren who know only that grandfather served in tanks. His first name, is somewhere in the muster rolls of the 3rd Royal Tank Regiment, but no one has yet gone looking for it in a way that has produced a public answer, that is often how the private soldiers of decisive moments vanish. Not through disrespect, through the simple fact that history keeps a better record of officers than of the sergeants who actually pull the trigger. The Tiger stopped being untouchable when the Comet was built, not because the Comet was a miracle, but because a nation had finally listened, finally learned, finally built the machine its soldiers had always deserved. Thank you for staying with the story to the end. If it meant something to you, let the men who lived it be remembered. Let a British sergeant in a wood in northern Germany, whose first name we do not know, stand for every tank soldier who climbed into a machine that could not save him and did his job anyway. Let Pip Roberts, watching his division rumble past Winston Churchill in a ruined Berlin, stand for every commander who sent boys into fights they should not have had to make. Let the engineers of Leyland Motors stand for every quiet civilian in every wartime factory who tried as hard as human beings can try to get it right in time. The Comet, the tank that arrived too late and just in time.